Oh, hey, man. Oh, you all right? Let me pick you up there, buddy. Let's go ahead and solve this puzzle together. I got you. I got you. Let me just pick you up. Be right as rain in no time. Just slot you in right there. Yep. Oh, almost. All right, buddy. Teamwork makes the dream work. Come on, we got this. Yeah. All right. All right, man. Let me get you out of there. We'll head on out. Just get you a loot. You know, actually. You've probably heard the terms eurojank or Slavjank at one time or another in your gaming career. Now, these terms describe an ambitious but unpolished, low-budget game made in Eastern European or Slavic countries. And while stuff like Stalker or Gothic prove that these games can be worth enduring despite some rough edges, not all eurojank is so easy to root for. One especially suspect subgenre that's cropped up recently is adult-themed body horror that mines the distinctive styles of H.P. Lovecraft, H.R. Giger, and Zdzislaw Beksinski. I'm talking trashy but playable stuff like Lust for Darkness and Lust from Beyond, but I'm also talking unplayable meme fodder like the tasteless and broken Agony, or Interchange, the slow, switch-flipping, sometimes shooter that somehow made Beksinski boring. So when Scorn came along bearing all the markers of this goofball subgenre, from its Slavic developer, Kickstarter budget, provocative visuals, and clunky-looking gameplay, you can imagine my reticence. But the public didn't share that same reticence, and the hype grew and grew. I just had to concede that people must really like looking at psychosexual imagery while they fuss with wonky controls and run from monsters. I mean, Silent Hill 2 made a career off that, right? Oh! Fine, I thought. When it hits Game Pass, I'll give it a fair shot. And so I did. I can't say Scorn ever blew me away. It often drew frustration or even indifference from me, but it does have its flashes of brilliance, especially towards the end, that made me wonder why the game hadn't leaned into these best aspects sooner. Scorn's moody art design is often incredible, and is supported by some clever puzzles. But many other puzzles waste your time pretending to be more complex than they are, the combat is awful, and the game's narrative is so withholding that it can almost be more trouble than it's worth to study. Which is too bad, because once you start really playing detective, there's a pretty creative and haunting mystery to be solved here. Suffice to say, Scorn is a victory hard won, and relies a lot on the player humoring it. So, to figure out if this game is right for you, I'll give you an in-depth, classic review detailing mechanics and presentation, and then we'll break off into some story theories for those of us who have played the game, or who are just really interested in whether the story is good enough to play through in the first place. So let's get stuck in like a parasite tail into a dildo gun, and see if Scorn is worth the pain. Scorn's challenging to like when it wants to be, and not just in terms of difficulty. It's moody and withholding about its narrative, and its gameplay can be punishing and obtuse. Scorn does have some unpleasant similarities to Agony and Interchange, as we've said, but I think it's safe to say it's in a league above those games. I sure hope so! But understanding what Scorn is and where its strengths lie is central to setting your expectations so you can enjoy it, or justify why you don't. So let's get the boring, categorical stuff out of the way first. Ebb Software's creative director, Lubomir Piklar, called the game survival horror, and its mixture of puzzles and exploration with deliberate combat matches that description pretty well. Now, of course, Twitter had to have a fit. Inconceivable! About whether it fit survival horror genre conventions or not, or whether it was really just a walking sim. And I get the criticism to some degree, as there's a lot of, I'm walking here! I'm walking here! Now, still others decried how much proposed content was cut from the final release, and how the Steam description falsely claims open-endedness and non-linearity, which couldn't be less true. Some of these detractors are definitely being petty, but I'd have to concede some ground to them because even after 8 years of development, Scorn seems somewhat confused as to how to be the best version of itself, and it can feel bland to downright inhospitable at times. This makes sense ironically if you consider that the word scorn is defined as an expression of contempt or derision. Scorn can feel like it's asking too much of you, like it holds you in contempt, but that's also scorn as a place to live in. It's an unforgiving, callous, and manipulative hellscape, playing out the survival of the fittest, but with cruel, socially engineered precision. Now, a lot of the finer detail beyond this point is gleaned from the art book, which provided me an embarrassment of context for a game that tries to be very coy about what's going on, providing no voiceovers or dialogue. So here's the story setup for Scorn as best as I can surmise it. The impetus for the Scorn world's level of cruelty seems to be desperation and degeneracy in equal measure. A poisonous atmosphere encroaches on this world, eroding all structures and killing or mutating all life into monstrous states. The world is in its death throes by the time we step into it, and much like the first Dark Souls game, the world has been hollowed out, ruined, eaten up, and left to fester. Corpses droop across industrial machinery like a fleshy jungle you must cut through to get the machines moving again for possibly the last time. Pitiful-looking creatures called moldmen are still being manufactured for slave labor or ground down into fuel for hulking machinery. An upper class of humanoids called Vitruvians are bred from the hallucinogenic blood of homunculi and given a third eye in their forehead so that they can be more receptive to the sadomasochistic rituals designed to achieve higher states of consciousness that, once completed, can then transfer their consciousness between bodies or to another plane entirely if possible. These guys will do anything and everything in hopes to get out, and like a metaphorical stampede, they will step on and over everything in their way to get there. There's a religious reverence for the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, but only as a means to an end, like someone attending church just so they can hope to avoid hell. As monstrous as this seems, Peklar says Scorn is not meant to be entirely alien to our world, but an extrapolation of it. It asks if we're being consumed by our love of technology till it's inextricable from our psyches, and we begin to lose our souls. These humanoids live in a post-moral world decimated by a scarcity of natural resources and a prevalence of natural disaster. Euphoria and escape at any cost are now the most noble callings. Now, speaking of these humanoids, let's meet them. Both of them. That's right, there are two protagonists who are closely tied together throughout the narrative, though you mostly play as the second one. The intro level opens with Scorn Guy 1, whom we'll call SG1 for short from now on, and he wakes up on his side and looks pretty messed up. Then he has a flashback about what led him to this point. He investigated a factory setting, had a key grafted into his left arm, acquired a piston weapon that can also unlock doors, and attempted to start up a giant, veiny, tree-like device which malfunctioned, then exploded white goo all over him, causing him to black out from exposure. The sexual imagery here is unmistakable, as he experiences a kind of orgasmic death and rebirth into something new. And then SG1 ventures out into the decaying wastes, where he experiences visions of a distant tower that beckons to him, suggesting salvation within. What could this mean, we're left to wonder? But before we can ponder too long, the scene changes and we wake up as another character inside the Genesis wall, whom we'll call SG2 for Scorn Guy 2. We find SG2 in the midst of his birth inside the Genesis wall, a uterine wall-looking organic mass that asexually generates the middle class of humanoids. These guys appear to be a higher caste than moldmen, but not as beautiful or equipped for transcendence as the Vitruvians, their lungs being exposed and wearing a chitinous carapace. From their first breath, the middle classers are tasked with survival, as leaving their cocoon means they fall straight down the side of the wall with nothing but their umbilical cord to break their fall. The pile of corpses at the base of the wall suggests that survival isn't likely or guaranteed. Interestingly, though, none of these corpses are infants, as the wall only generates creatures with adult sexual organs and stature. There's no place for innocence, nor time for growth here, as this world is on a crash course to escape and all hands must fulfill their designated roles within society as speedily as possible. Unlike SG1, this new guy SG2 sets off without any vision to inspire him, apparently guided only by genetically engineered instinct, and so he wanders, interfacing with and interacting with the world on a baser, more childlike level. Now, this childlike learning experience is pretty synonymous with how clueless the first-time player is going to feel too. Now, before we get into gameplay and mechanics though, let's talk a little about how the art design unmoors the player and makes them feel thrown into a dangerous new world. The chosen design mode is Giger's insectoid interior design, bleeding at the edges with Beksinski decay and emphasis on thin, bone-like exteriors or abstract monstrosities. Giger's the core and Beksinski's the garnish. Scorn's sound design tops all of this off and really makes the presentation hum. No pun intended. I have never heard so many unique, gross, and fully 3D sound effects in one game, from the crackle of chitinous shells being broken, to the squish of your fingers sliding into fleshy holes, to activate consoles, to the piercing scream of the Parasite, whom we'll meet shortly. Like 2011's Dark Souls and Limbo, Scorn feels cavernous, oppressed by a roar of silence broken only by machinery creaking to life in the distance. The music itself is mostly just atmospheric tones, but there are a couple tracks that accompany the final levels that are truly haunting and really made me squirm. So kudos there. Scorn's core vibe works for the most part, and it's certainly the main attraction for many fans, right? And I dig it too on a base level, but I often felt underserved by the actual variety of the composition and the functionality of the levels as play space. While the last levels are sumptuous feasts for the eyes, numerous stretches of the game are just Giger 101 based templates with no flair, and there are just too few truly screenshotable vistas or monsters to look at, which is even worse considering how many locations were cut from the game, like the blasted labyrinth or the tower. And while a dying world doesn't need to pop like, say, Ghost of Tsushima's Flowers in the Wind do, I honestly wondered if there were technical limitations being accounted for because of how basic the decaying particle effects looked and how often the mist looks like it's trying to cover up real estate to reduce rendering load versus adding mystique. Now, that's not to say that areas like the crater with its snaking braids and mutated corpses aren't horrifically affecting at first, but its visual idea, like much of the game, isn't played out with enough variety within itself to not just sort of blur together and become background noise after a period of time. That's not where you want to be with a game that proposes to be an interactive art gallery of sorts. And speaking of art gallery, this plays into the walking sim complaint that many fans had on release, and I get it. Walking sims are criticized for feeling like the world is constructed for the player and don't exist outside of waiting for your input to spring to life. Despite Peklar saying he wanted the world to feel strange yet intuitive to interact with, Scorn ends up unavoidably feeling kind of static and waiting to be switch flipped into action. Ammo, health stations, and puzzles are about as creatively designed as they can be, but their very existence can just feel like someone adding a flavor or a coat of paint to an everyday game convention that is likely to rescind your suspension of disbelief pretty quickly. Now, one funny example is how I had to run all over to find fittings for a key so that it would fit into a lock that opened a tumbler puzzle that, once solved, made a plant with 4 birthing pods, give me a skeleton key fob, and somehow killed the Vitruvian inside the pod. The what? I can't say I know what just happened or how to solve the disconnect here and other places, as it's probably just an occupational hazard for video games with this much emphasis on their mood over an internal logic that makes the place more believable. But what's not as easy to dismiss is how linear and prescriptive the game is, yet how full of red herrings it is, trying to make you believe things are more complex than they really are. You'll spend a good deal of time wondering what to do because you're aware of the contrivance of, well, you're playing a game, yet how little internal logic these weird devices seem to present to you about how they work and what you're able to do next. A game with solutions this linear shouldn't have this many time wasters built in to artificially create negative space, like numerous dead ends, repeated assets that disorient you, or how many areas have so much to interact with that make you think a puzzle is asking to be solved when you actually end up just spending 10 to 15 minutes tinkering around, but the second puzzle upstairs actually holds the item that lets you start this one in the first place, so you have to move on and come back. This happens in the game's very first level, and is actually the very first puzzle encounter that you have, so this is quite a gamble to take with the player's attention span right off the bat. In my playthrough, I took about 15 minutes to fool around with all of the weird devices and sit through their plotting animations before I finally left the area and found that there was an elevator that took me upstairs to a slide puzzle that I needed to do first. This slide puzzle involves retrieving an encased creature and sending him below, where I could then use the previously seen devices to extract him from his shell and then use his help to solve a third unrelated puzzle. Now, allow me one digression on this slide puzzle. I am not awesome at puzzles, but I have heard way too many people talk about how this puzzle was just way too hard, basically made them quit the game. I mean, it's long-winded, but it's just not that complex, and I really never felt flustered or like I was being punked. So I just wanted to speak up in that puzzle's defense real quick. It's not that bad, guys. I really think y'all are equipped to handle it.
Anyway,
once you're done with this puzzle, the mold man is sent below, and you'll return to this area and start transferring him between stations to brutally free him so he can help you solve a two-man door puzzle. Now, I love the conceptual scale of this puzzle. It's really good, but man, was the game's communication of this idea needlessly distracting and confusing at first, hiding the required first part of the puzzle far away from the second part, which you actually encounter first. Now, this crops up again later in the second level, where you solve a multi-floor puzzle to free up an elevator, but again, all the machinery in the final stage of this puzzle is what you see first, and what you're incentivized to fool with, not realizing that while it looks like it'll make you progress now, it's doing actual factual nothing, and you need to move on and come back later. But fortunately, the smaller scale puzzles tend to be a lot more fun and thematically satisfying. I really enjoyed the lockpicking minigames, and especially the twist where one blocks off half the puzzle so you can't see where part of the lock spins and must listen to the click of it slotting into a groove to know when to activate your pick. And if you thought the Mold Man puzzle was dark, then you've not seen anything yet. A great set piece takes place in and around the giant creature called the Crater Queen, who's generating the infected enemies that you face in the game. A fun thing to think about is whether the atmosphere mutated the Queen or whether the goo spillage from SG-1 made all this happen, but it's really hard to say. Let me know if you figured this out, by the way. Regardless, the practical sense this crater level makes I couldn't tell you, but essentially you open up doorways within the body of this creature so you can pass through her and take the tram line to the final area. Now this seems to represent perhaps a C-section or going into traumatic labor, something H.R. Giger experienced himself and which showed up prolifically in his work. So in a way, SG-2 is essentially having a traumatic labor before he ostensibly goes to be fully reborn in the final levels. Now, there's just one thing that might ultimately stop him, though, and strangely enough, it's the first protagonist whom we saw get consumed by the white goo explosion. We're now getting dangerously close to the theory section where I unpack my master theory of exactly what's going on here and who the first protagonist is and why that matters and a lot more. But first, here's one light spoiler to prep you, but also to give those who don't want full spoilers enough info to understand the central conflict of the game. Okay, here goes. When SG-2 makes his way to the factory and into a very familiar room with a giant growth in the middle and white goo everywhere, he sees a lizard-like monstrosity slithering away just out of sight. This monster shows up again very soon, viciously ripping open his abdomen and latching onto him like a parasite, which is what he's called. But if you'll notice, the end of this creature's tail is exactly like the piston gun the first protagonist acquired, and his left hand has a device on it just like the first protagonist did too. The conclusion is pretty simple. Something about the goo mutated SG-1 into a monstrous parasite and he's coming after you now. Now that he has you, it's a struggle to see if you can outlast the parasite long enough to complete your nebulous goals. Peclara says the parasite's inclusion was to explore how it feels to lose control of your own body, which is probably also an allusion to the central theme of losing ourselves to technology, our minds being sucked into screens till we feel disembodied. The parasite's identity has another really interesting layer of thematic import too, but we'll investigate that later in a spoiler section. An interesting bit of nuance that I can tell you now, though, is that just how technology can be very dangerous and yet very helpful, so too can the parasite. Despite clearly wanting to possess and violate you, the parasite also inadvertently gives you access to the piston gun attached to his tail, which you can use to defend yourself with in open locked areas. His tail also acts as a Swiss Army knife of sorts that can have different gun attachments slotted in. That your only chance of surviving comes from the creature on your back leeching away your life is no small source of irony. Unfortunately, this ability suite brings us to Scorn's most controversial and undercooked element, its shooter combat. Now first, I have to give props to how gloriously icky the guns look and feel, as they have this insectoid, chitinous appearance and a life to them a la the alien weapons in Half-Life or 2006's Prey. They slot together like little bugs slide into their shells, and the loading animation essentially looks like you're planting seeds. It's also strange and fascinating to look at, and I appreciate how inspired and transformative these simple actions felt. What I did not appreciate was actually using these guns. Have you ever seen Scumhead's Shrine series or Vomitorium? They also have this kind of Hellraiser meets the Guyver or Warframe look and feel to them, but the action's vast and intense. Scorn goes the other way, as you might expect, it being survival horror and all, but it's miserable to pull off and in serious need of tuning. If the gun's heaviness and the deliberate way in which Scorn Guy 2 lists them to aim is supposed to indicate a struggle for control between here and the parasite, that's thematically cool and all, but it makes for awful gameplay. I missed so many times or was hit before I could get a shot off because of how long it takes to aim and how long it takes to center your aim. And don't get me started on the reloading animations. They are the slowest I have ever seen in a video game, and have an obnoxious depth of field effect that blurs out all the enemies you're needing to steer clear of while you're doing this. It just makes engaging enemies a tedious chore as you try to pull off these proactive but slow actions, often getting hit by projectiles and dying before you can retaliate. Now the only saving grace is you can run from most enemies and cause them to lose interest and despawn eventually if you get far enough away, but sometimes this just isn't an option either, and you have to try and dodge around big, bull-like enemies in extremely narrow corridors, often getting stuck on the environments and getting rammed to death anyway. And if you ever run out of bullets, which does happen sometimes, your only offensive option is the piston gun, which has really inconsistent hit detection and an extremely slow recharge timer. Another frustrating part of the combat is how spaced out some checkpoints are, meaning that if you're operating on a sliver of life and get killed, you'll often have to do several game actions again and sit through their long animations before you can get back to the troublesome area, and hope not to get one-shotted from afar yet again. I loathed nearly every second of combat and was so glad when it was over. There's only one single enjoyable fight, and it's in the last level that I was very pleased with from a lore standpoint, but also how well it was balanced. And I just wondered why this wasn't more attainable the whole way through. And I've even heard a vocal minority muse that this just should have been a puzzle game with no combat, but I also think that goes too far and messes up quite a bit of the game's symbolism and lore. This is a place of violence and hatred, and presuming to think that anything could be accomplished here without cracking some heads is pretty ridiculous. Not to mention the Parasite who gives you the ability to fight back while literally holding you back from living your best life is an incredibly provocative and compelling image, and I don't think the game wants to lose that. And that's pretty much my overall impressions of Scorn as a video game. It's got some great visuals and some excellent sound work, and while the combat's miserable and the puzzles are of uneven quality, at least it's going for more engaging gameplay than most walking sims or Agony Interchain style games. You can rest easy knowing it's at least way better than those. But you may not get as much out of Scorn if you don't read the art book and do your due diligence to get fan input and all the implications of the story. It's withholding about what's going on to a point where its neat visuals may not compel you to keep playing though, and I don't think you could be faulted for that. But that the game rewards the inquisitive mind is a good thing, and it's a risk that's worth the reward for those who press the game for answers to get the most out of the experience. And speaking of answers, I think it's high time I stop teasing you about spoilers and we get right down to business. It's Scornin' time. Much like David Lynch's Twin Peaks, Scorn likely isn't fully comprehensible or even consistent enough to truly come up with a master theory that accounts for everything, and that's not just me saying that. Beklar said that the team self-admittedly wasn't trying to make everything line up perfectly, and that incongruities will inevitably exist. And the fact that a lot of context clues in the art book didn't make it into the final game may also give you some pause too when theorizing about what's canon. Now, a master theory could go on forever trying to account for everything, so I'm just going to focus on these three aspects. How the ascension process that Scorn people are obsessed with actually works, the true nature of the Parasite, and what these say about each other metaphysically. Understanding how these interplay with one another will help us understand not only the culture of Scorn, but what the game's message means as well. So bear with me, because this will be a deep dive. So let's jump straight to the last level of Polis, or Polis, where this ascension takes place. Judging by the murals and statues, Polis seems entirely inhabited by the upper-class Vitruvians who are primarily occupying their time with sex and masochism to achieve states of higher consciousness. If you want to ascend, apparently you're going to have to go through some intense stuff. Case in point, when SG2 arrives in the Ascension room, he puts himself on a rack, a vacuum rises and starts to fillet him, and then a surgeon bot cuts open his entrails and connects his brain to a hive mind above. Sent to a higher state of being by sexual euphoria and the pain of being cut open, you're able to travel outside your body and remotely control the shell bodies in the room to try and reach the glowing portal called a Nexus further on. What all this means exactly is fairly nebulous, but it's important that you're missing a key element of this transferal process that's hinted at in the room prior. In the previous room, there's a mural depicting a flayed-out Vitruvian on the left, a shell body on the right, and a Cthulhu-like creature resting atop both their heads as if it's facilitating a transfer of something between them. The art book states that this creature represents the physical form that one's consciousness takes when transferring into a shell, fusing with it to become a higher being, which is the great goal of all Scornians. Now, if this consciousness creature is part of the greatest step in Scornian evolution, then why does it bear such a striking resemblance to the monster's Parasite, whom the art book calls a character unto himself, making him feel like an anomaly, a one-off? I mean, they both have a protuberant brain at the top. The Cthulhu creature has the third eye on its forehead, and the Parasite has one at the base of its brain, as well as SG-1's face on his back. Both have whip-like tongues and similar ribcage and fin patterns, and the Parasite splays itself out like wings at the top, just like the consciousness creature. So what does this obvious physical connection mean? I think it means two things. That Vitruvians aren't separate species, but the next step in humanoid evolution, and that the Parasite is a perverted consciousness creature, a one-of-a-kind freak accident. Let me explain. SG-1's face on the back of the Parasite has the facial markings and the third eye of a Vitruvian, which is weird because if you use a free camera mod, it shows us that he doesn't have the smooth and muscular Vitruvian body, but the same carapace collar and exposed lungs as SG-2, ostensibly meaning they both start out as the same middle-class humanoid, like from the Genesis wall. Now this in tandem with how Vitruvians look like regular middle-classers underneath their white exoskeleton makes me entertain the notion that Vitruvians might not be a separate species, but the next step in evolution if the right process is applied. Now, what confuses this theory a little bit is the vinyl promo art at the end of the art book, which clearly shows a Vitruvian being consumed by a parasitic substance, which you would think would represent the Parasite and SG-1 from the game, right? To me, this is either too much mismatched information, or we need to concede that Ebb Software just maybe didn't change SG-1's bottle modi? Or we need to concede that Ebb Software lazily just didn't change SG-1's body model to match his Vitruvian self because they didn't think people were going to look down and see, or it was because it was only one level. What's the harm? Why change it? But if we want to entertain the more interesting branch of theory that both Scorn guys started out the same but diverged once the Parasite entered the picture, here's where it gets interesting. Now we have to get a little creative to make this all fit, but I think it's likely that Vitruvians are made by possibly shearing middle-class humanoids of their carapaces once they're seen as fit for ascension so that they can fit inside these sleek white exoskeletons. Then they're exposed to a carefully balanced recipe of mutagens like hallucinogenic homunculi blood and probably white goo and other substances,
marijuana and heroin,
and left to evolve into a higher being with a third eye capable of transcending into their final shell form. That the exoskeletons have no orifices in them, not even eye holes, and the consciousness being has all the ribs and legs of a regular human body in its form, almost makes me wonder if the insides of a Vitruvian get maybe cooked down into a yolk so they can reform into the rather primordial consciousness creature when it's time to leave. That might explain why the Vitruvian dies when we open up his pod, getting the key fob. It's possible we prematurely stopped a healing process when he was reforming internally, getting his brainstem ready to leave when he eventually participated in the ascension process. It's also worth noting that we probably took the key fob meant only for Vitruvians, since it's the only way a pleb like us could ever get to Polis in the first place. Regardless, though, if it's true that Vitruvianism is attainable under the right genetic engineering, it also stands to reason that the wrong genetic engineering could have bad results, and I think that's what happened with the Parasite. He resembles the consciousness form because he's a perversion of it, a malignant consciousness mutated by the white goo accident instead of proper Vitruvian conditioning that would ready the consciousness for its ascension to a final shell. That's also probably why the Parasite keeps trying to inhabit SG-2's body, because there are clearly no empty shells around, so his instinct compels him to possess you instead. It's also relevant that in this place that worships copulation and procreation, the Parasite is forcing himself on you to create a new being, which he ends up doing in the end. A bad rebirth led to the Parasite, right? Who now goes around trying to rape SG-2 and fuse with him like if he were finding his new shell. But he's not the only interrupted or malformed pregnancy or motherhood symbol in the game. Neither all female or mother imagery in the game is a mockery. The corrupted Genesis Wall spits out newborns with no regard for their safety. The Creator Queen, which grew from the Genesis Wall, is chained up and used to make hordes of monstrous children as fast as possible. The homunculi are test tube creatures who look like fetuses and whom you submit to ghastly operations so you can use their parts, resembling abortion. The pregnant male-bodied shells suggest either a supplanting of women's singular ability to carry a child, or a pragmatic need to make up for them possibly having died out or being infertile. And maybe that's why Scorn people took to mad science to figure out ways to genetically engineer what couldn't be born. But no matter the cause, this also meant that Scorn people began to view sex as a drug to achieve higher consciousness, robbing it of its intimate and caring qualities, much like the dehumanizing plague of pornography our buddy technology has visited upon us in the real world. This world doesn't care for its children either, whether by sex or by test tube, because this world doesn't value the sexual union or what it produces. A culture that no longer recognizes or understands sex, womanhood, motherhood, or the value of human life is now beset by slave classes made of old body parts, monstrous children, stillborns, abortions, traumatic childbirth, and rape. This world really needs a woman's touch. But that's just a very large and interesting facet of the larger message. Like Dr. Frankenstein subverted the natural order by creating life nearly asexually through a man and leaving out the woman, so too do Scornians suffer from starting out with a morally compromised blueprint for new life. No matter how many cycles of life, death, and rebirth occur, they can't make a truly transcendent creature, it doesn't seem. And the Parasite, the embodiment of fractured creation, must squelch SG-2's ascension because he's denied his own by the nature of his mutation, and in the process, the Parasite acts as a sort of justice for SG-2's crimes of abusing the mold man and violating the Creator Queen, just like any of his forebears would have, and probably have many times. The final shot depicts the two straining to look at one another as they become inextricable, both stuck in spectacular, gruesome failure, both scorner and scorned. As French surrealist poet Isidore Lucien de Casse once said, throughout the centuries, man has considered himself beautiful. I rather suppose that man only believes in his own beauty out of pride, that he is not really beautiful, and he suspects this himself. For why does he look on the face of his fellow man with such scorn? Alright, well welcome back if you skipped that intensive lore deep dive. I want this section to be not too much of what you just read if you power through the spoilers, but also want to give those who didn't partake a good sense of what we talked about as well, and that's got to start with the Parasite and how he relates to Scorn's message about the fragile relationship of humanity to technology. The Parasite represents losing the self to an outside entity like technology, as he is the offspring of technology malfunctioning and causing great destruction. He also has to be a damning commentary about how mad science has left the lower and middle classes in a war with each other when they're the ones being exploited by the upper class. A free camera mod allows you to zoom out and see the character models for SG-1 and SG-2 while playing, and both are regular Genesis Wall Scorn guys with exposed lungs and carapace collars. They should be looking out for each other, not consuming one another, not fighting for control while the powerful above fritter away their lives with sex and masochism rituals while the machines far away churn to make new Vitruvians using slave labor or monstrous experimentation. And yet the middle class eats itself here, while others are ground down into meat chunks and thrown into the furnace to keep the train of manifest destiny chugging along the bloody track. And regardless if SG-1 was a Vitruvian the whole time, or he got mutated into a deformed one when he became the Parasite, perhaps this is really a story about the privileged jealously holding back the advancement of the weak and the poor, much like in one of those movies that Korean director Bong Joon-ho would make. His movies, like Snowpiercer and the coincidentally named Parasite, always feature the struggle between upper and lower classes, and the violent retribution that ensues when the lower classes have had enough. The story hits hard regardless if it's about an unremarkable middle class fighting over the last scraps of their dignity, or if it's a damning commentary on privileged people dehumanizing their lesser brethren. The Parasite also represents a similar kind of karmic retribution for the sins of the whole world. He comes through SG-2 like an angel of death, a grim reaper, even though you two could very well be the last representatives of your dying race. This place would seek to kill itself just to punish a lower classman for arrogantly seeking to rise above his station in life. Even the angels of death practice vengeance and not justice here because there is no God, no sacred places that Scorn people won't defile in their crusade of self-preservation. And as the final shot fades to black, accompanied by one of the most haunting tracks you'll ever hear, I couldn't help but feel empty and yet strangely satisfied by this lack of satisfaction. A lack of catharsis is probably all this place of contempt could offer. You couldn't draw blood from this stone, though this game, if any, would certainly try. So I'm torn on Scorn as a game. It's often very linear and prescriptive, yet still somehow manages to be confusing, and its combat is one of the most agonizing experiences of my recent life. But the last level is phenomenal, and justifies all the different level design gimmicks, and delivers some of the most unnerving set pieces I've ever seen. Top that all off with interesting and elusive lore, and you've got a game that rewards pushing past its pains to find its pleasures. But what do I know? After all, a wise man once said,
"Life is pain, Highness. Anyone who says differently is selling something."
So is Scorn worth the pain? It's hard to say, but my guess is yes for the average player, as it's inarguably unique, albeit messy. Worst case, you get to see some really cool sights and sounds and escape into a place that most games don't dare to go, and that should be applauded and experienced. So make a note on your calendar for some Scornin' time so that you can see if these bodily juices are worth the squeeze. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.